Well, good morning and good evening. As we are back with Focus on Australia today with our beautiful Kerri Saint. How are you, Kerri? But before we actually go into our chat today, we have a sponsor for our channel this month, and I want to just do a little bit of a blurb on them. Um, they are spooky too. Now, for those of you who watched previous interviews on actually solutions with Aquarius Rising Africa, we've actually done two interviews with John from Spooky 2. I want to highly recommend you guys go and catch his interviews. And I'll ask Morna if you can just put the links to those conversations in the chat because it's a great product. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of information on them, and then we'll stop in the middle of our chat somewhere, and we will then just do a little bit of a intro video. But Spooky 2 is the most highly advanced and versatile Rife system in the world. It's been developed since 2013 by an international team of electronics engineers, technical designers, software developers, and Rife practitioners. Spooky 2 is a Rife machine that works on Royal Rife's principles. It gives you not one, but many Rife machines in one package with plasma, contact, remote, PEMF, cold laser, and more. So it can also be used as a PEMF machine. So they have a Facebook page with more than 59,500 users, and they're always open to answer questions. They're all, not only that, but I have to say they have a host of amazing products, natural products, which are, I don't want to say it's age defying, and I don't want to use the word anti-aging, and this is just me saying this, but amazing, very cost-effective health products which are incredible. So we're going to put the link down below. Basically, what you really do to get a discount is you put Chantal, you use the coupon code Chantal, and you'll get a 5% discount on your Spooky 2 product. So we've had some great feedback on that already. So I highly recommend that you guys take a look at that and see if it might be for you. So over to you, Kerri, beautiful Saint. Thank you so much for joining me today again. And look forward to hearing about what we're going to be talking about. Margaret Sanger. Now, that's not someone I've actually heard it before, but really interested to know what you have to say about her.
Okay. Well, I want to say good evening because it's evening where I live in Australia, and we're having some really weird weather here at the moment. So I got sunburnt the other day, and now today in particular, I'm running around with warm clothes on. So nice icy cold blast coming up down south, and very weird.
Is this weather manipulation, do you think?
I don't know. Someone might be manipulating it. There's a lot of manipulation going on. I don't think it's just the weather, Chantal. I think manipulation's been going on for a long time. And being a former forced adoption victim, I'm pretty well understand how things can be manipulated to suit a narrative or to suit, where they want to push the populace or society to get the results they want.
Absolutely. I don't know if any of our viewers have actually seen, but I actually posted it on my Twitter page. A few days ago, there was two girls on a beach in Australia, and I don't know why I want to say Queensland, but I'm not sure. And they noticed, like in this beach sand, this sort of black sand. It looked like black sand, but on closer inspection, what they did was they took a magnet, a normal magnet, and they put it in the sand. It's insane when you see the graphite that just attracts to the magnet. And it's like the minute it attracts itself to the magnet, it multiplies. It kind of multiplies itself. It's the most freaky, scary thing ever. And what they're saying is they think that is being used, they're doing that spray with this crop spraying and all this stuff. That's how they're putting it there. So, I mean, that is like very hectic that they're actually going to those levels, right?
Seen that. I'd be interested in to see it because I haven't seen other videos on this graphite, like on quite a large scale. It just kind of moves it in a really weird sort of direction, and yeah, it's I was a bit surprised when I first saw it, and I think that was before we went into lockdowns and stuff. So I actually saw that stuff, and a lot of politicians and people within industry looking around and watching this stuff just really morph like out of some sort of a sci-fi movie. I thought it was quite, bit out there for me, but who knows what goes on? Us people who just want to live a normal everyday life. There's definitely things that go on behind closed doors and corridors that many of us aren't witness to, or we get secondhand news from, and we rely on people, whistleblowers and such, to feed us information. And so if I wasn't speaking up about forced adoption, a lot of people wouldn't know the depths of what went on there, because it's not what people have presumed it to be. It's our culture goes on kind of so many of us just asleep, in the sense of how other people are being affected by different policies of government, and what they're actually doing, and whether they have an agenda or not, and what their agenda is, and where they want to push people and have people to think and stuff. It helps to be a really good critical thinker about things and weigh things up. So
I watched an interview yesterday, and there was an ex-CIA guy on there when he was talking about all of this pedophilia and stuff, these elite pedophile rings and stuff like that. And he was just saying, and he put it very succinctly, and he said, it's a barrier that human beings have to cross in their mind. I mean, obviously, we understand it as cognitive dissonance, but I think the way he put it was so well put. It's a barrier that the majority of humans still have to cross to actually perceive that this is going on, and it has been going on for such a long time. Because for the average human being to cross that barrier, every bit of safety, every bit of security, every bit of belief they've had is shattered. It's like, if these are the people that are doing these horrific things that we're watching, that we only see in movies, and this is actually happening, and these are the people that are doing it, it is too crazy for the average person to even want to think that that can be going on.
That it's even possible. It would be an interesting one to have a look into, the boy with the henna tattoo, and that's to do with pedophilia and adoption, and it's a case not well known by the public, but because I'm an adoptee, I will kind of go on a bit of a ferret for different stories and people who are affected and how. But we'll maybe leave that for another time.
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. So it's not a good story. It's quite horrific, but it delves into a deeper level on what can happen when we have adoption laws or practices that keep the rest of society in a kind of like a stupor, and people don't realise what's going on at a lower level or behind closed doors. It's quite astounding, actually. So, and on what you were saying, I really love, for me, like I was a teacher, and not a teacher, I taught life skills. I was a youth worker for 17 years. And I often worked with children that had been abused or were illiterate, or found that the schooling system failed them. I'm not saying they failed the system, the schooling system failed them. So I was always kind of trying to come up with really creative ways to get people outside of the way that they actually thought, or the way that they had raised within their family and how things were structured for them to see things. So I'm going to bring up a bit of a picture for you, Chantal, and I want you to tell me what you see. Now, you may have seen this, so you know, you might blow me away with the fact you may have already seen it. So I'm going to bring up a picture, and I want you to tell me what you actually see. Now, let me bring it up.
I see the side of someone's head, actually.
Can you see
It's
it?
like a profile, yes.
Yep. I'll
That's
bring it
what I
back a bit.
see. Oh my goodness, now I see a witch's nose. Looks like a witch.
Yep.
A nose with the face and the hair and the...
Yep. So
And the
that's nose and mouth and hair. There's a hair going up, sorry, that way,
yeah.
so that we can see a hair. Oh, like a thing over the top of her head and a black hair. So what if I told you there's a young woman there as well?
Yes, but that's the first thing I saw.
Did you see the
The
young woman or the old woman first?
No, the young one first. I see her profile. It's like there's
Yes.
her chin, ear, side of her face.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
That's what
that's
I
pretty
saw.
good. That's pretty good. You saw both. So, you know, a lot of people, you hold that up, now you either see an old woman or a young woman. And a lot of people look at it and go, I can't see one or the other. And it
Wow.
takes for someone to point it out to them to go, there's both there. So the young woman that's her hair, and that's the
Yes.
side of her face, and that's her ear, and that's her like jaw, like, you know, down her line, and here's her neck. But if you
Yes.
look at it the other way, what is her face is the old woman's nose with the eye and her mouth in the neck area. So it's just a little analogy for people to understand that what they see isn't the whole picture. So if you saw
Exactly.
an old woman, you were right, but you only saw half the picture. If you saw a young woman, you're right, but you only saw half the picture. Some people are, you know, gifted like yourself, they get to see both and they can see it clearly. So that's where I like to go. I like to help people to see both sides of the picture, not just one,
Yes.
because there's always another side to the picture, always is. So, so I wanted to bring up, because last time we spoke, we talked about adoption and we talked about you know, suicide and adoption, and we brought up, you know, what actually happened in Australia in between the 1940s to the 1980s, and that there were 250,000 stolen children by former forced adoptions here, just in Australia alone, and that the screening processes of those children were pretty poor. They were really flawed. So some children like myself went to places where they were abused. And of course, I grew up working in charcoal pits and grew up with a lot of abuse, a lot of physical and mental abuse. So in my journey in doing research to try and understand what happened and why it happened, I've had to find out myself that there's a flip side to adoption, because they told me my mother died giving birth to me and didn't want me, when in fact that was a complete lie. So I've had to adjust to my change of picture. So in my search to kind of understand how adoption ended up going in the stream it did, I came across a lady called Margaret Sanger. Now, America would be very familiar with Margaret Sanger because she is basically the woman that started the American Birth Control League in 1921, and it became a part of the Planned Parenthood and Federation of America in 1942. So she was born in 1879. Her father was Michael Hennessy and her mother was Anne Higgins. And he was an Irish Catholic that immigrated from Ireland to the United States when he was 14. He studied medicine and phrenology. So if nobody knows what phrenology is, that's like involves measurements of bumps on the skull to predict and determine one's mental and personality traits. And it's seen today as a pseudoscience, but this is what he was into. He became an atheist and a women's suffrage activist, which I thought was quite interesting. And I kind of wondered why. Now, her mother, Anne, in 22 years, bore 18 children, only 11 survived, and she died at age 49. Now, Margaret was number 16 of these children. She worked as a nurse, and she witnessed a lot of death from abortions, self-inflicted abortions, because there was no such thing as contraception. And back in those days, it was more of a pull in the essence of just make your husband sleep on the floor. Abstinence, because there was a lot of religious, control in those days. So she married in 1902 and had 3 children. One of them died. And during the marriage, she hung out with local intellectuals and left-wing artists and socialists. So she divorced in 1921 and remarried in 1922. In 1914, she created a newsletter. It was called The Women's Rebel, which promoted contraception using the slogan, and this kind of hit me quite hard when I found it. The slogan was "No gods, no masters." It was concerned about population control her whole life. So you just think about the slogan, "No gods, no masters." She had to flee to England in 1914 for violating the postal obscenity laws, because her newsletter breached that, what they call like a carriage. It was in the postal service and carriage, what they call some sort of carriage thing. And because it was morally not acceptable by society, she was meant to go to court on trial, but she fled to England. So when she gets over there, she meets a guy called Thomas Malthus, an English cleric, a big believer in abstinence, the idea that population growth was a threat to society. So I thought that was interesting. So where does this take her? So he was the author of what they call the Malthusian catastrophe, the idea that population growth is potentially exponential, while the growth of food supply and other resources are quite linear. So basically, his belief was that there was too much population, not enough supply, and we're going to self-combust. So he perceived the idea of charity to the poor as futile. So basically what he was saying is, don't give any charity to the poor, you're just going to create more poor. His idea led to the Poor Law Amendment Bill of 1834, and the act designed to force the poor to immigrate, to work for lower wages, eat coarser food, like really not good food, and it led to the construction of the workhouses. An interesting fact, a proponent of Malthusianism was the novelist Harriet Martineau, known as the first woman socialist, who later in life became an atheist, whose circle of acquaintances included Charles Darwin. The idea of Malthus was significant influence on the inception of Darwin's theory of evolution. So I hope you know where this is leading you. So Darwin was so impressed by the idea that population growth would eventually lead to more organisms that could possibly survive any given environment. It led him to theorize that those organisms with a relative advantage in the struggle for survival and reproduction would pass its characteristics on to the next generation. So basically he's saying the strongest and smartest and most skilled would survive only. So what happened was proponents of Malthusianism and Darwinism actually joined forces, coming up with the field of eugenics, right? So eugenics was actually alive and well in America prior to the Second World War. They were already sterilizing children and anybody who was seen as sort of like a low socioeconomic person, a criminal, morally sort of deficient sort of person. So what eugenics is a belief and practice that aim to provide genetic quality of human population and attempts to alter human gene pools by excluding people and groups judged to be inferior and promoting those judged to be superior. Basically, it's called selective breeding. Right? Now you got to go, okay.
I mean, this is insane.
I know. So I had to think about Margaret, and I had to think about her childhood, and I had to think about the fact that her mother had given birth to 18 children, only 11 survived. There was no contraception. And then she had a father where he got, actually, did I mention that he studied medicine, but yeah, and then he ended up being a stonemason. So it's quite possible he was a Freemason. So, but I'll get back to that. So anyway, she ends up going. She's in England, and so she's made all these connections, and she ends up going back to the United States, and pushes for her version, basically, of this Malthuism and Taoism together, and her idea, I suppose, of what she grew up with, and being a nurse and seeing women die of being, putting out so many babies all the time and no contraception, and then backyard abortions. And because there was no help for the poor, because they lived on this concept that if you're poor, you don't deserve help. You need to, we can't keep breeding poor people. So it's a really wild thing. So at the moment, like in the States, there's a call to remove her monument and statue, right? She's been lauded as a woman that really fought for women's rights and the right to their own body. Now, I don't dispute that she may have done that, and a lot of her intentions may have been good. And proponents of hers have, and I want to state this here, have actually stated that some of the comments I'm going to mention that she has said or written, or the media at the time wrote and quoted her, that they have actually said that she's being misquoted. But I've actually read parts of her book, which actually backs up some of the information I'm going to share here. So she proposed, so she goes back to America, and she proposed allowing Congress to solve a population problem by appointing a parliament of population. She called various methods of population control, including abortion, defending the unborn against their own disabilities. Right? Because if they're being brought into a poor household where the mother is, even immoral, then you're actually saving it from its own disabilities that it's going to have for the rest of its life. Sanger believed the United States should keep the doors of immigration closed, the entrance of certain aliens whose condition is known to be detrimental to the stamina of the race, such as, and I want you to hear some of these words because they applied it to adoption, such as feeble-minded, idiots, morons, insane, syphilitic, epileptic, criminal, and professional prostitutes, and others in this class barred by the immigration laws of 1924. She believed that. Well, she was behind them. There was this big push to basically bring in these laws only those of moral upper standing and married and intellect and who weren't poor were the only ones that should have had the right to breed. So she believed that large families were detrimental to society. She states the most serious evil of our times is that of encouraging the bringing into the world of large families. The most immoral practice of the day is breeding too many children, she wrote. So, we've got God saying, go forth and multiply. And we have this woman who, based on her childhood and influences and where she ends up going, over to England and who she meets. And so she's come back to America with a vengeance and you've got to think of America in the sense of adoption and abortion. And she's been lauded with statues and all sorts of things. But she wasn't the only guilty party, but I'm pulling her out as, someone of interest. Population control, she wrote, should bring about the materials of a new race. If we are to develop in America a new race with a racial soul, we must keep the birth rate within the scope of our ability to understand as well as to educate. We must not encourage reproduction beyond our capacity to assimilate our numbers so as to make the coming generation into such physically fit, mentally capable, socially alert individuals as are the ideal of democracy. She also wrote that an excess in population must be reduced. War, famine, poverty, and oppression of the workers will continue while women make life cheap. That's what she states. Okay, she writes, we do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, she wrote. So what she did was encouraged a lot of abortions within the Black communities, and she employed, in the sense, the clerics or the ministers to encourage it and to soften the reasonings as to why abortion should be more readily available. But the premise behind it was to deplenish, if not exterminate, the Black person. An interview with Mike Wallace in 1957, Sanger said, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents. They have no chance in the world to be a human being. So she had some really twisted ideas. She said she was an advocate at a proposal called American Baby Code. The result desired obviously selective births. So this, she was quoted in American Needs a Code for Babies, March 27, 1934, and they were Margaret Sanger's papers, Library of Congress. While advocating for the baby code, she argued that marriage licenses should provide couples with the right to only a common household, but not parenthood. In fact, couples should have to obtain a permit to be parents. So she wanted all these parents, and you had to pass a test, in a sense, like it would have been financial and mental and physical, only the fittest. So this was what she pushed for. So the premise
when we speak about her background, I mean, did you say she was one of how many children?
Mum had 18 children. She was
so her mother had 18 children, of whom 11 survived.
Correct.
Now, I mean, I like to look at these things because it makes sense to me that her upbringing would be the reason that she is doing what she's doing to the extreme. Because, I mean, I come from a big family. We 6. I mean, it was cool. But it has its advantages as well as its disadvantages, right? And I'm trying to think how it must be for a child, though, in a family where 18 children are born. And when 18 children are born, 11 survive. Her mother must have been exhausted. There must have been no money. There must have been no food. There must have been living like scrunched up sardines in an apartment or a home or whatever. So I'm not surprised that she would have developed such extreme ideas, actually. When we look at that, when we look at from when she came. So I'm wondering, because obviously growing up in Africa as well, there's a lot of that where, it's exactly what the apartheid government tried to do here. They try to exterminate the African people. In the 80s, they were putting AIDS into the smallpox jabs. And that was how they were supposed to eliminate the African population throughout Africa, right?
Yeah.
So when that didn't happen, and obviously all of this stuff, I mean, we're looking at more and more stuff, but I mean, these guys have been trying to get rid of human beings for a very, very long time in this way. I look at a lot of the poverty that's in Africa, And we understand, I mean, you know, for me, when you're looking at, especially in the apartheid era, and let me tell you, it hasn't changed much now with these guys. And in fact, it's probably worse. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
When people are in poverty, I think the one good, pleasurable thing that they feel is sexual pleasure. So that's probably the one thing they can have is sex. And of course, we understand that when you have sex, you procreate. So instead of uplifting the population and understanding that to suppress another aspect of humanity is certainly not serving anyone whatsoever. In fact, what happens is you get the opposite result thereof. So I'm wondering, though, how does one find that balance? Because I can imagine for that mother, having 18 children must have been a godforsaken nightmare, you know?
49. So with her mother dying at 49, that would have had even a greater, huge impact upon her as a young girl, where she had to be raised by her older sisters. And so Margaret got into nursing herself, and then she saw it again with the many women that she came across, probably married and unmarried, because of, you know, people couldn't find work, and, you know, women were used and abused by men or abandoned by men. And then, you know, the women were trying to get help being pregnant and not wanting to conceive, because that was the first thing she brought up, was women need contraception. But she was kind of stomped on for asking that question, because they had to live by a religious moral code.
Exactly.
So and I sort of read it and I thought, well, in what respect does Margaret Sanger's belief, how does it evolve into adoption? Like, and when you look at joining eugenics and Malthuism together, and the whole premise of only those with a high moral code are allowed to have children. And I'll go on that in a little bit. Like, so I'll drop in. So where's the fit with adoption? Where's the fit? There has to be a build up to the fact that we had countries like America and England and Australia and Canada in particular, with these large adoption, you know, a mass adoption that were happening from single mothers. Because I grew up believing my mother didn't want me. Did we all of a sudden just have mothers who flipped and said, you know, very strangely, which is something that most mothers, to be a mother, a woman to be a mother is the most beautiful thing on earth. But apparently en masse all around the world, there was all these women going, no, I don't want to be a mother. I don't care. I want to give it up. You know, and I just thought that was really strange. And I had been sold a picture that it was normal for my mother to reject me. But what I've come to understand is that my mother was a victim to the types of people like Sanger, who had a unfortunate upbringing that drove her to not just to provide women with contraception or to provide them with unwanted pregnancies so they wanted to abort their children. She lost focus on the fact that what would be the most important thing to do is to care for those mothers and those families in the situation that they're in so that they thrive. Yeah. But instead it goes off into an area that it's about, you know, selective breeding and genocide.
I agree. I'm just going to stop for an ad break at the moment, and then we're going to take it further after that.
Nikola Tesla said, if you wish to understand the universe, think in terms of energy and vibration. Everything in the universe has a natural vibrating frequency. This is called a resonant frequency. A Rife machine uses the principles of Royal Rife, a brilliant scientist who lived during the last century. He discovered that microorganisms can be destroyed using frequencies. If a sound or signal shares the same resonant frequency, healing miracles can happen. Today, more and more people are learning from the past and using frequencies to treat specific problems. Albert Einstein's vision of the future is being released. We all carry the burden of unwanted guests in our bodies. Parasites, viruses, bacteria, and mold can make our life miserable and painful. Thankfully, there are good people in the world who still practice Dr. Rife's work and have recently developed new, innovative, and easy-to-use products that you can actually use in your own home. Spooky 2 is the most effective and affordable Rife system available today. They offer free software updates, and the world's largest frequency database will ensure you that your Spooky 2 product will always be superior. Spooky 2 can deliver these frequencies with extreme precision and return you to good health. There are lots of true stories about healing disease with the use of Spooky 2 Rife machine. They are shared by our Spooky 2 users. You can check more details via this link.
Thank you, Spooky 2. Sorry, Kerri, about that. And I want to just say, I so understand. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that her modus operandi is the way that is the best way at all. But I understand where that comes from. And I'm saying that, what you're also saying is that there's this whole, because of religious beliefs and stuff like that, there's that we have to consider in these situations. Absolutely. And absolutely, the moms have to be cared for. But how does a woman in that situation where A, she's suppressed, B, her religious indoctrination is that she can't take birth control, she can't have birth control. I think birth control in any event, the poll only came in the early 60s as far as I know. I know here in South Africa anyway, I don't know about the rest of the world. So what is the middle ground that one finds? Because there has to be, for a woman to still maybe choose to have a religious belief saying, well, I don't want to take contraception because that's against God's will. But by the same token, to have 18 children and 11 die or 11 survive, your body must be finished. Your body, I'm not surprised. I'm actually surprised she reached the age of 49. So what is the balance then where women can still be empowered, enjoy intimacy with their men without thinking that every single time they're having sex, they're falling pregnant and there's a baby on the way and the whole family suffers because of that? Or where does one find that balance where you take care of the people, but then how do you say to the husband, you can't have sex with your wife in case she falls pregnant? I mean, you tell a man that, it's a whole different story. So there has to be a balance. How do we actually look at this in an objective way and find solutions?
Well, we know now that women have contraception and choice, and that was something that was taken from them based on the society in which they lived at the time, but it was enforced. So, she obviously brought up contraception with the doctors at the time, and there must have been something that could have been done. But because of the way that Malthus himself was, being a cleric, he just wanted everybody to remain abstinent, to stop having these babies. But it wasn't that. There was no compassion for the poor. There was no compassion for if it happened. There was no compassion to help a person up. And I said this last time when the last interview I had was that in former forced adoptions, it was between the 1940s to the 1980s. And it seemed that very clearly that the message being sold was that you kick the mother to the curb and help yourself to her baby. You only save the baby, you don't save the mother. And I couldn't understand that, not from where I came from. I couldn't understand. And my own mother, who was forced to give me up, will tell you that she chose to give me, that was her choice. But she didn't have a choice because the health and department at the time, which was kind of like the welfare that oversaw everybody's life, would turn up on her doorstep because she was poor. She was a widow with 4 children, and basically tell her that she had to get a job or provide better. And if she didn't give me up for adoption, not only would they take me, but they would take her other 4 children. At no stage did they ever offer her an alternative. And I believe choice is when you actually have a choice worth pursuing, not a gun held to your head.
Absolutely.
You have to go this way or it's going to be worse for you. That's not a choice.
No.
But my mother died believing that she was given a choice. And she thought the better choice, she was never given the choice to keep me, never given that opportunity or option or hand up to keep me. And that's the problem that we have in this, is that, you know, Margaret obviously had a view based on her lived experience and her life, but she also went down a path that then became, how I
Very
would put it, as dogmatic and fixated on only people who have a higher standard of living, a higher intellect, and a moral worth had the right to have children. So this is what happened with adoption. So when they flipped and they made my mother null and void in the sense of a right to keep her child, they deemed her as inferior and gave me to who they believed to be more superior than her, because they fit society's standard of what was acceptable. So they were married and had a job, and they were able to present with 2 character references. So, but the sad thing is that I would have been better off staying with my mother, who would have, yes, I probably would have grown up with, not the, the fancy things of life. However, I would have grown up within my biological family, and I would have grown up without being abused. And I would have grown up believing who I was and achieving many things in life. But they shifted me because they deemed, like in Malthuism and eugenics, is that they believed that if I'd stayed with my mother, then I would have turned out to be morally deficient like her. That's their premise for it. And they couldn't allow that because, remember, Malthuism states that if poor people are going to breed like rabbits, then we don't have the resources for it, and society will collapse on itself. That's the whole premise of where they went. So after the war, after World War II, society changed a lot, and because this is when we start having this real push for adoption. Thousands of children in Australia were adopted each year, not hundreds, thousands. By 1972, in that year alone, 10,000 children were adopted just in Queensland, in the state in which I live. That's a hell of a lot of children. So after World War II, society changed, and there were many more widows, single mothers, and a large increase in infertility, particularly among the men that came back from war. The new social landscape had significantly changed, and psychologists favoured the nature versus nurture concept, stating that a child's development was seen as being more influenced by basically where they grew up, not within their biological framework. So this is how they start to go, well, let's take Kerri from her mother, and because all this, who she's going to grow up with, it doesn't matter, we'll throw her over here, because they started coming up with this concept called the blank slate theory. So basically, I've lost my note. So the metaphor for a child being akin to a clean slate was embraced, so that all the children, once regulated to not even being, but well, basically not being, by being before born defective, they were seen as defective stock. And by putting them with adoptive parents outside of the defective parent, they could potentially be whomever that parent wanted them to be. So they've wiped DNA. So you've got to think about Darwin's theory of evolution, right? And then you've got to think about adoption was, well, let's take a baby out of its biological environment because we want to change how that child's going to grow up. So we then have to shift it over here to new parents, acceptable, more superior parents, and we got to take it straight from birth. So this is why the mothers had pillows placed on their stomachs at the point of birth, and they were handcuffed to the beds or tied to the beds or drugged. So she could not make eye contact with that baby because they believed the minute that that baby made physical eye contact, that it had bonded with mother. So they would whisk that baby away and then select the adoptive parents that could have been on a waiting list, and that baby was shuffled off and expected to grow up to exactly how the adoptive parents would instill in it. And remember, the last time we spoke, I talked about identity. We were stripped of everything that was true about us. So we couldn't speak about adoption. We couldn't speak about our mothers. We couldn't speak about our biological fathers. We had to stay in this box, in this lane of our adoptive parents and how they expected us to grow up. So this is why I said we are the best actors there is by default, because we could never be ourselves. They wanted to strip us of any biological connection to our biological parents. And that's why our birth certificates were changed. So on my birth certificate, my father, and most adoptees do not have their fathers listed at all, only our mothers. And then they wipe that away from us, and then they give us a new birth certificate stating the adoptive parents are our biological parents.
This is so tragic. You know, when we look at these things and we hear these stories, it is so, so tragic, because it's, you know, going back to what you were saying last week, you know, when a child is born, even though the umbilical cord is separated at birth, it still energetically, spiritually stays connected to its mother for the next 10 months. So therefore, it makes a lot of sense why it's important to sleep with your child, hold them tight, let them hear you, let them know you're around. So to really have that first year, especially with your child. I would be interested to know what you say about this comment here, Kerri. No, sorry, not that one. Look at the Sweden from Lena. Hi, Lena. Thank you for these comments, because I'm actually looking at the Swedish stuff right now as well, because I know there's lots of dodgy stuff that comes out of there. But the Swedes love to whitewash it.
Margaret Sanger, like I said, I didn't want to hang Margaret Sanger out completely to dry on this. I wanted people to understand that, you know, what might be driving a particular person to go where they went. And there were other players in it. There were many players in where they went, in the essence of, because you've got to remember, like, if there were people coming up with these theories, you know, and they're thrown in their mix, and then they get themselves into lobby, to be activists, into politics, and then they start having influence on society as a whole. So it happened in many countries. It just did not happen in Australia, but it certainly filtered here because eugenics became very strong over here. I mean, after the war, Hitler's soldiers were quite incredulous of the fact that they were held at the Nuremberg trials for killing the Jews, when they turned around and said, well, America was doing the eugenics well before we were.
Yeah.
So if anybody looks into the the Senate inquiry into former forced adoptions, and they have a look at what happened to some of the babies that were taken, we all didn't go to adoptive families. We didn't all go to loving adoptive families. They actually graded us as well. We were defective stock. Now, let me tell you what some of the defective stock were. These are mixed race. So we all know in Australia what happened to many of the children to Aboriginal families that were of mixed race, right? So I had ginger hair and a deformed foot. So basically, I was defective stock. So I went to adoptive parents, to the adoptive parents that I deserved. So I was categorized as what they call a B grade baby. So any child that was born with any defect, which red hair was apparently a really bad defect, nobody wanted to adopt them. Children of mixed race were defective. Children with disabilities were defective. So they, if you didn't end up in some form of some type of adoptive family, and I reckon that's why I went to the family I went to and was abused the way I was, because the adoptive parents were already categorized as some form of defect. And then children went to homes, to institutions, and if they read some of the reports, they will clearly see that children who were adopted by the priests ended up in these institutions and were experimented on for vaccines and were castrated because they were seen as defective stock. So if people want to actually take the time, it's the I've got the report here. It's the Australian. I keep coming up with two different things. So it's the Senate report, a Community Affairs Reference Committee into former forced adoptions. But if you can go online and you can actually read submissions still, and you can read where between the 1940s and 1980s they were still castrating and experimenting on little children who their mothers wanted them. The single mothers either married the fathers or wanted to raise them as their own children, were totally prevented from doing that. The human rights were violated, and the mums were sent on their way, and the babies weren't adopted. They in institutions or foster care and were abused and never got adopted. So when people tell me that my government is not capable of atrocities, I would say think again, because you need to dig a little bit deeper, because atrocities occurred at a large scale in former forced adoptions.
I think these forced adoptions have absolutely, completely been so underplayed, and I think it's one of the biggest things that they're covering up on this planet right now. You know, the more we're hearing about this, and the way, I mean, you look at the turn of the century when all these kids suddenly were sent to flood these, 30 years later, suddenly sent to flood these cities all over Europe that had obviously people had died out in, all over the world, in fact. And that was coming from the adoptions, not the adoptions, the orphans.
Orphan trains, yes. I have looked into that because I'm really curious as the depth of that. When I saw that, I can't remember which state it was in America, but there were 80,000 babies in incubators in these they had these like exhibitions or in different countries, but America had a lot of them in different states. In one particular state, there are 80,000 newborns in incubators that were available for adoption. You could pay to go and see these babies. I thought it was absolutely, and then my brain was going, where did they get 80,000 babies in incubators? I've seen the footage of it. And
and they used to have them at these shows. And they used to, whatever these shows were, these theme parks type things, there were these babies in these incubators for people to look at. And I mean, exactly, where did these babies come from and where were they going? You know, the way that it's been covered up, it's disgusting, and it has to come to the surface, that's for sure. So I really hope anyone who has been adopted goes to the effort to find your parents, because I think there's so much stuff that people have been fed, so much nonsense
Correct.
that people have been fed over the years. It's astounding, actually.
Yeah. I would hope that through you and I having these little chats about adoption, that people will begin to question it and begin to talk to adopted people in a whole new light, rather than hold us in sort of like I call it bondage, by telling us and that we should be grateful, because the minute you do that, you're actually keeping us silent and in our pain, and you're not helping us to heal from the wounds of being torn from our mothers and our fathers and our brothers and our sisters and grandparents from birth. You're not helping us, you're hindering us in healing, because we need to have a voice. We need to be able to express that even though we may love our adoptive parents, we hate adoption. We hate what happened to us. We hate being torn from our identity and our true belonging within our family. And it's painful. And that pain and grief increases with age. It doesn't decrease.
Look at this comment here. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
To nurse your child for 6 weeks and then have it taken away from you.
Yeah. So,
I mean, how traumatic is that? Yeah.
Yeah. They did do that. They did do that before they brought in what they call the blank slate theory. And if you have a look at Ireland in particular, they would nurse them for up to 2 years, the babies, before they were taken from them and adopted all over the world. I couldn't imagine anything so horrific as to actually hold your baby being held hostage in an institution, knowing that any minute they will come and take your baby. And many times the mothers never even got a chance to say goodbye, because they were only allowed to feed their baby, put it back in the nursery, and go back and work in the laundry. And that's what happened. And I've suffered the loss of a child myself. I would not wish that on anybody. And I know that I at least know where my son is. When you have a child kidnapped, because this is what it is. If you have not willingly wanted to hand over your baby for adoption and it was forcibly taken from you, there is no other word for it but kidnapping. And we sell it to the community and we call it adoption. We've packaged it as this pretty, sweet, loving thing called adoption, and it's kidnapping. You have been medically raped, in the sense that that baby was torn from you whilst you were in your most vulnerable, emotional state. And this baby has been torn from you. Do you imagine how these mothers have tried to survive for the rest of the damage, the psychological damage on them? 40% of these mothers never had another baby. Now, if you think about Margaret Sanger, Margaret Sanger's mother kept having other babies. She got to probably hold her baby before it was taken and buried. She probably got a chance to cry. Our mothers never got to hold us or see us. And when they went back to their communities and their families, they weren't even allowed to whisper our names. So they were completely shut down at every level to talk about the trauma that happened to them. They were told consistently, it is not your baby. You can go and have another one. So 40% never had another baby. They were so traumatized by what happened. But there was also a large percentage of them that went straight back out and fell pregnant straight away to make up for the grief and the loss that they endured. They were married pretty much the first man they found, or they married the father of the baby because the grief was so great. And then they brought other children into the marriage. Can you imagine the mother and the grief she carries? And I've had mothers say this story, being pregnant and going into hospital and fearing. They're married now, they've got the ring on their finger, but fearing, the intense fear, are they going to take my second baby? And how that's passed on to that child. Growing up in the womb, having that mother living in fear constantly, and that second child being brought into that fear.
Absolutely. We all know, anyone who knows anything about how this works understands that the child will absorb its mom's fear and literally take that on as its own.
Yeah. So
wow.
I just wanted to state that any single mother who wanted to keep a baby was actually deemed neurotic by the psychiatrists, psychologists, medical board, social workers, nurses, doctors, because she did not have the good sense or the intellect to know that she is inferior and would not raise up a socially accepted child. She could only raise an inferior child and only increase the probability of its downfall on it and society in general. So these children needed to be saved, and the sooner the better, under the nature versus nurture theory, ready to be moulded into whatever the adoptive parents deem them to be. The prevailing attitude of forced adoption era still exists within society. I believe it still exists today, how about in a somewhat slightly changed form. We have removed illegitimacy as a reason for taking children, but we've added other things like welfare bludger, drug addict, a child of the system. So if you were in the welfare system as a foster child, you're likely to have your child taken. War and poverty. That all these things eclipse the belief that if a child is born under such circumstances, then they should be adopted under today's standards. And we still hold up anybody who wants to adopt as somehow being better than anybody else. If you look at movie stars that adopt, or anybody else that has a YouTube channel and they say, oh, I adopted my baby from Ethiopia, they get lauded with, aren't you wonderful, aren't you wonderful? So it's changed in a form.
Africa. Oh, this echo is awful. I'm not sure if the viewers can hear it. Yeah, but it's true what you say is that, when it's, these movie stars and these celebrities adopt these kids, especially these African kids. And as you say, they're lauded as these heroes and these amazing, incredible beings. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, they have very nefarious agenda. You look at Charlize Theron, South Africa's Hollywood movie star who adopts a little black boy called Jackson, and a few years later it's become a girl. Now it's running around a complete girl. I mean, how do you do that to a child? What on earth? Why did she think she needed to do that to her child? Again, it's all just part of that nefarious agenda that these people all get involved in. I shudder to think. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, people ask me, why did my adoptive parents adopt? Why would you adopt children and abuse them terribly and make them work in child slave labor? Why would you do that to them? What was your reasoning for adopting them? If you can't have children of your own, why don't you cherish the ones you were given? And, I've never really had it answered, but I think that society put such pressure on them to have children, and they resented the fact that they never had their own children, and they were dumped with these children. They're kind of forced on them by what society expected married couples to have children, and they resented them.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Scary thought when, we have society dictating to parents and creating laws and stamping them as unfit when they're not, but because we've got this sort of ruling that we decide, the ruling classes decide who's acceptable to breed and who's acceptable to raise their children. It's an insane concept. But for me, I just wanted to share that, growing up being adopted, I accepted what was told to me, in the essence of why I was available for adoption. I believed all the lies until I found out that my mother was not, because I was told my mother died giving birth to me. I found out, in my 20s that my mother was alive and well. And I started digging and finding out there were far more lies that I could comprehend, and they just keep on coming. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Kerri, we're out of time for today, but again, an incredibly interesting conversation. And thank you so much for bringing to the fore these atrocities that are occurring. And again, the more of us who know about these things, the better. It really brings a lot of light to understanding a lot of the issues around people who've been adopted as well. Not just, and as you say, not really something to be grateful for in the way that we have, a lot of people seem to think. But anyway, I want to say thank you so much, Kerri. Really, really appreciate you being here. Is there anything else you'd like to say just in closing to our viewers?
Look, there's probably plenty I want to say about adoption. And this
You'll
has
be back,
my
though. You'll be
yeah.
back. You'll be back.
I just want to implore anybody who's adopted and heard this, finds a safe person to speak to, because sometimes, this may be the first time you're hearing the depth and the truth of adoption, what your mother may experience. The reality of that will hit you at some stage. And so find a safe person to speak to, find safe space for yourself. And if you're not an adopted person, open your heart up to really embrace adopted people in their truth, not in the narrative that society has sold you.
And it's so crazy because how often haven't we heard that this child was adopted and it's the problem child of the family, and you don't know where it came from. And it's so crazy because when you really understand, when we really start understanding what not only the child goes through, but the trauma that the mother goes through as well. And, not just from these horrific people doing it, but very often the child's own grandparents have forced that upon their mother.
Definitely.
I find that appalling. I find it disgusting. And if you are a grandparent or a parent who has a child having a baby and you are forcing that child to give that child up for adoption, I don't care if it's 12 or 14 or 16, it is your responsibility to make sure that child is safe and kept within your family. I don't care what anyone says. I definitely feel very strongly about these things. To make your child give up your grandchild is disgusting. And if you are one of those, please change that, because we can see it's bad enough that these horrible predators are out there forcing this upon women and children and men all over the world. It's tragic to think that your own mother or father would force this upon you as well. I hear about this a lot. And on my journey as a healer, and that's why I bring this up, because on my journey as a healer for many years, I've been told time and time again how maybe the girl fell pregnant when she was 16 or 15 or 18, and the parents forced her to give the child up for adoption, and she's never allowed to talk about it again. What parent does that to their child? I'm sorry, that is just wrong. Anyway, Kerri, enough of my bitch for that moment, because I find this very disturbing, and we will definitely be having regular conversations around this. Look forward to having you back again in a couple of weeks, Kerri. So thank you. And thank you to our viewers for watching. Please share this stuff. It's so important to share and just get it out there and, create awareness, because so few people are aware that this was actually going on. And up until, Kerri, that I met you, I know maybe 6 or 8 months ago now, I had no idea this existed. I mean, I knew about adoption. I had no idea that this sort of stuff existed, that there were forced adoptions, and that the kids actually had to go into slave labor and horrifically sexually abused and molested and put into very, very, very hectic situations. So please, let's all just open our hearts. Let's show compassion. If you know someone who's adopted and maybe they haven't been through something like this, but that sense of disconnection, maybe abandonment that every adopted child feels at birth, could be the reason why they play up in your relationship. If you're a partner to an adopted person, I will guarantee you, you're probably going to have abandonment issues. And it's generally that you need to be dealing with that. And this I know through my own experience dealing with people who've been adopted. So, God bless you, Kerri. Thank you so much. Really, really, really appreciate you. We'll have you back in a couple of days again. Thanks to our beautiful viewers for participating. Really love your comments. So thanks so much. Take care, everybody. God bless you all.